The North Atlantic War by Michael Trela. Operation Stepping Stone. Stage 1. Decision. Rubble and dust blew through the streets in great clouds. The shouts and grunts of hundreds of men at work could be heard for miles around. The thunder and screeching of massive vehicles as they pummeled and transported debris completed the cacophony. The reconstruction of Kulisuk would be a long and arduous one, but the people of the Republic were all for it. 6 different companies from across the nation formed the bulkhead of the project, while hundreds of citizens, many of whom had called Kulisuk their home before the invasion, volunteered to assist the massive undertaking. Native Greenlanders, Germans, Russians, Americans, Canadians, Swedes, Irish, and several more groups of immigrants could be seen working side by side to repair their home. Leave it to a war to fully unite a nation. James McKinley was in a somber mood again, a trait which seemed to pervade his overall disposition ever since the war was declared. Though the newspaper which he currently held was filled to the margins with positivity and hope-filled propaganda, he knew full well that there was still a war to win. One victory was nothing in comparison to the conflict that this would no doubt evolve into. He placed the papers down onto his desk and rose from his seat. He generally had an easier time thinking while standing or walking about. He had quite a bit to think about. What would the aggressors do now that the Republic had revealed their true colors? How would the War Department decide to handle the rest of the conflict? How much would this war cost to fight? Where would his sons Michael and Patrick fall into the grand scheme of it? The duty of Chancellor was a tough one indeed, and war was certainly no stress reliever. Thinking back, McKinley couldn't see how he, of all people, had come to such a position of power. How he had become a politician. He was a businessman, a man who woke up in the morning, worked at his company's headquarters, came home in the afternoon, and spent time with his family. Now that he was Chancellor, that was nigh impossible. His aptitude for the political environment, as well as his general popularity, had begun to manifest itself 3 months before the general elections had been called for with their official separation from Denmark. Once the news got out, it was none other than McKinley's boss who had recommended that he run. And not just him, but the company's entire board of directors were of the same mind. However, it wasn't until he was brought the situation to his wife and, surprisingly, received her blessing on the matter that he accepted the challenge. From there, the story spiraled through months of chaos, as his family, friends, and coworkers got his campaign up and into full swing. Now, here he was, leading a country by baby steps through a war. What a mess, he thought to himself. No time for family, friends, or even myself. He took a look up at the crucifix which hung over the office's doorway. Well, you went through worse. He took a deep breath. If this cup cannot pass without my drinking of it, your will be done. Just as the words left his lips, the door opened, and his secretary stepped in. Mr. Chancellor, General Ironside and Seth request a meeting. They say that it's urgent, and that your presence is imperative. McKinley nodded. Very well. Inform them that I'm on my way. The secretary nodded and proceeded out the door. As the Chancellor made to follow, he stopped short right as he turned around the doorpost. There, standing against the wall in front of him at parade rest, were Ironside and Seth. Chancellor McKinley, sir, they said with salutes. At ease. So it's that bad, after all. Indeed it is, Ironside replied, motioning for the other man to step forward. We believe you should see this, James, the Chief of Staff said with a frown, handing him a tablet. The Chancellor paused a moment before activating the device. If he sees fit to address me by my first name, then the situation is more serious than even I had thought. He looked gravely at the generals who stood before him, the two returning his expression in kind. With a sigh, McKinley unlocked the tablet screen. Oh my God. Blant couldn't help but pace nervously about his living room. He had left the Parliament building in a state of chaos as the members of the different houses and departments endlessly bickered over what was to be done concerning the North Atlantic Republic. 100,000 men had been lost in the space of less than a week. 100,000. And not only that, but Admiral Clint Rolfe had been taken prisoner. The poor man. He'd been one of those less inclined to stepping in to the aid of the Danes, and had only accepted the position of admiral of the expeditionary force at Blant's personal request. Now he's a prisoner of war, the Prime Minister lamented. He's a captive, and it's all my fault. He stopped pacing and slumped down onto his bed, his face buried in his hands. The invasion of Greenland had devolved into the biggest military blunder of the 21st century, and the whole world would be holding him personally responsible. Blant couldn't bear the thought of going down in history as a heartless monster of a man who sent 100,000 innocent men blindly to their demise. At some point during this moment of intense stress for him, the house phone began to ring. He paid it no heed, nor, in fact, did he even notice it, so engrossed in his thoughts he was. It wasn't until his wife entered the bedroom, holding the phone in her hand, that he temporarily snapped out of his self-pity. "Dear," his wife said, "you have a call from the Defense Department. They say it's urgent." The Prime Minister took the phone. "I suppose it's good that I'm still in my suit, then," he said with an ironic smile. "This is Prime Minister Blant." "Marshal, we have got a situation on our hands, one which none of us were anticipating." It was Cronroy himself. That never happened. Whatever was going on had to be important, and it couldn't be good. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Blant asked after a moment's pause. "I think that it would be better if I showed you," Cronroy replied. "We need you to come to the Ministry of Defense building right away. Kimbridge and I will be awaiting your arrival." "At 12 o'clock in the morning? Must we discuss such stressful matters at such an ungodly hour of the night?" "It's regarding the Danes, sir. They're planning on making a move that has disaster written all over it. Apparently they are taking our initial landing's failure a little worse than we are." "The Danes?" Blant jumped off the bed, his rapid motion startling his wife, who was still standing nearby. "That's all I needed to hear, Wilhelm." He darted out the door, slamming the phone back onto his port and swiping his jacket off the hanger with such force that the aluminum was bent. "I'll be back later, Cynthia," he called out behind him as he rushed down the stairs and out the front door. Cynthia Blant stood in the doorway, watching as the car sped down the street and out of sight. "I've never seen you so distressed, Marshal," she whispered. She continued to gaze down into the deserted night streets for a moment longer, only turning to head back inside when a sudden chill wind sprang up. "It must be this bloody war we've gotten tangled up in." It was barely 15 minutes later that Blant pulled up to the Ministry of Defense and hurried through the main entrance. Over the last few months, he had visited this building far too often for his liking, making his understanding of the structure's layout as clear as that of his own home. The soldier stationed outside the strategy room barely had time to announce his arrival to the men gathered within before he blew past them. "Prime Minister, I'm glad you came," Cronroy said, giving Blant an earnest look. "With the Danes' action at stake, I won't be kept in the dark again," he replied angrily. "Now what are those Scandinavian wannabes up to this time that could cripple our nations further?" "Those Danish dogs are up to trouble again, Marshal." Kimbridge was just as sour as ever, only he looked a good year or so older than he had before months ago. The lack of sleep caused by near constant dealings with their allies was obviously taking its toll. "Only this time they've just about crossed the line. I mean, I knew that they wanted Greenland back, but to want it back this badly is almost impossible to comprehend." This was definitely bad. For even the pompous, outspoken Kimbridge to be this concerned meant a real catastrophe on the horizon. "Well then, would someone please just tell me what's going on that's causing all this commotion?" Cronroy nodded to a young officer holding a single sheet of paper. The man handed it to Blant, who took it and scrutinized it. No, they wouldn't dare do such a thing. We could have had the entire rest of the world on our backs for such an atrocity." They've already started, said Kimbridge coldly. Pull it up on the screen. The massive monitor on the room's westernmost wall flicked to life, showing the locations of their own ships, which had been meant to reinforce the assaults on Greenland. What caught his attention, though, was the group of markers traveling north around Scotland at full speed. It was a massive fleet of Danish ships. The direction in which they were headed confirmed the fears of all in the room. No, the Prime Minister whispered again. Please, no. General Johan Iversen, commanding officer of the Danish Expeditionary Force, analyzed the map laid out before him, studying its every detail until he could point out the location of a rabbit's hole with his eyes closed. There was a screen table beneath it, designed and built for the task, but Iversen was a traditionalist. A tangible, markable, transportable map was his strategic tool of choice over the touchscreen holographics display monitor of the screen table. The map was that of the North Atlantic Ocean. Northern Canada, Greenland, Iceland, Ireland, Great Britain, and the Scandinavian nations were each depicted in painstaking detail. The Premier had made sure that Greenland was depicted properly on it, with cities, railroads, ports, industrial sectors, etc. 10 minutes prior, the entire officer corps assigned to the Expeditionary Force, along with their assistants and aides, were packed around the central table. One could barely hear oneself thinking with all the noise and commotion wrought by their excited strategizing and incessant scribbling on the map. Over an hour had transpired, during which time no sound strategy had been developed, before they adjourned the meeting, to be taken up the next day, with hopes that some actual progress would be made. Hopefully, he muttered to himself. Now only the general remained, though the pencil markings, eraser shavings, and indents left from the prior meeting's participants were left. The southeastern coast of Greenland was bare of any markings representative of British troops, now that the enemy had revealed their true strength. Without the proper technology to gauge the Greenlanders' power from afar, sending the British in first to do the job was a stroke of genius by the Premier. None of them had expected them to win. Though total obliteration was not an anticipated outcome either, they had served their purpose nonetheless. That having been said, Iversen was now faced with the problem of finding out the best plan of attack in his own invasion of the Republic. He knew that it would be a joint force operation, combining the 300,000 forces of his own with the 400,000 of the British reinforcements, but that's as far as he currently was. The Premier's plans, as far as he knew, only stretched so far. He picked up a black, erasable marker and removed the cap, holding it ready to draw out a plan the moment one presented itself. Once I've thought up 2 or 3, I'll use the red marker to highlight the best one. Several minutes passed without an iota of useful strategy. It was just too far away from the target to come up with anything sound. He put the cap back onto the marker and sat it next to the red one, leaning against the table on both hands. The door to the room opened slowly, but he ignored it as he focused all his efforts on strategizing. The one who had entered casually walked up next to him and looked over the map. Having a bit of strategizer's block, General? Iversen nearly startled as he recognized the voice of the other man. Premier Van Housen, sir. My sincerest apologies. I didn't realize that it was you who had joined me. The Premier waved it off nonchalantly. Don't be silly, Iversen. I'm here to enlighten you as to our next move in this great undertaking of taking back what is rightfully ours, not to punish you over such trivial matters as breaking your concentration just to greet me. The general breathed a sigh of relief and relaxed his shoulders. Well, I must say that I'm most delighted to receive this news, my Premier. What actions are we to take to ensure that this great nation of ours shall reclaim what those rebels stole? Van Housen smiled and looked up at the massive symbol of the Danish Communist Party, superimposed over the Denmark flag. Your patriotism is most admirable, Iversen, he said, beginning to slowly walk around the map on the table, and a considerable reassurance. You see, in these trying times, it often becomes unclear to many whose needs are senior on the priority list of gratification. Indeed, many people fall into the ideology that their own personal needs come before those of the community as a whole. He paused in his walk and turned his head to the general, raising an inquisitive eyebrow. Do you agree with that, Johann? Absolutely not, my premier. The community as a whole always takes priority over the individuals, for if the opposite were to occur, chaos and disarray would ensue as a result of the individual's greed and self-interest. Bravo, General, Van Helsing said with a clap of his hands. The community always comes first. I ask you these things because our next move will meet opposition among many selfish individuals who are blind to how beneficial it will be to our nation. You must be ready to see beyond them in order to bring about the good of all Denmark. I am always prepared to serve the People's Republic, my premier, Iverson replied, straightening up as he did so. The premier smiled. Excellent. I'm glad I can trust you, General Iverson. He stepped up next to him and grabbed the red marker. Here is where you and our friends in Britain shall send your troops. He removed the marker's cap and made a single circle on the map. Iverson was stunned. Pardon my asking, sir, but will our allies agree to this? I will make sure they do, Van Helsing replied. It will provide us a strong foothold and forward base for further operations. He looked up into the general's eyes. You are with me on this, are you not? He was hesitant to answer. Yes, sir, my premier. I shall have my forces set out immediately. Very good, General. I knew I could count on you. With that, he began to make his way to the door. For the common good, he called back as the doors closed behind him. For the common good, Iverson said half-heartedly to himself. He couldn't budge, his gaze transfixed by the red encircled spot on the map. It was Iceland.